Hey everybody, here we are talking about stressed, depressed, and totally broke, the Great Depression in America. And it is very depressing. It's like nothing anyone's ever experienced before, at least in modern times. We've had some depressions and they were bad, but this is far worse than anything that's ever happened to this point. This is the 1930s, basically. The almost the entirety of the decade is going to be like what I'm about to describe to you. Most people are familiar with the stock market crash of 1929. You can see the high point of the stock market there in about October. This graph's not totally exact anyway, but it's good enough. Roughly in October of 1929. And then you can see the low point is in 1932, and it doesn't come up very far from there. And most people would say, well, the stock market crash caused the Great Depression. It's not nearly that simple. And even in the oversimplified way we're going to talk about it, it's not really that simple. One thing I do want to point out here, though, as you look on the screen, this is where Hoover's presidency fits in to the Great Depression. And Hoover may be one of the unluckiest, if not the unluckiest president of the United States, because he's elected. You saw how crushingly he won in 1928 and how popular he was. He's a businessman. Everyone thought, well, we need a businessman to keep America going. And that's how he ran. And then the stock market collapsed about 6 months after he took office, and it never looked back. In his entire presidency, things are getting worse and worse and worse and worse. And he'll get crushed in 1932 in that election. So I feel really bad for Hoover because while certainly he could have done things differently, I suppose, the reality is almost all of this is completely out of his hands. But he is the president, so he catches the blame as much as the credit when things happen. So I want you to envision the economy as if it were a three-legged stool you see here on the screen. Three-legged stools are great, by the way. If you have a three-legged stool, it will never, ever wobble. Did you know that? Four-legged stools wobble all the time. Most people have four-legged stools in their kitchen or something like that, and they're annoying. But three-legged stools can't wobble. They're super solid and structurally sound. But when you lose one of the legs, the whole thing falls down, right? So consider this illustration for a minute. The American economy and most economies, I guess all economies are, again, in a simplified way built like this. There are three pillars of that economy, and one is the banking system, the financial system, and we have a very complex one in this country. Another is industry, so factories and all that. We talked about Henry Ford and all that kind of thing in previous times. And the other one is agriculture. And all of those are terribly important to the economy. The stock market crash that we just talked about in 1929 essentially broke the banking leg in half, and the rest of it came tumbling down. But the reality is all three legs are rotten in the core, but you just don't know it. All three legs are weak. If any one of these legs breaks, the whole thing comes down. It just so happens to be the stock market crash. And so I would say yes, in a sort of a direct sense, the stock market crash then brought everything else to its knees. But the stock market crash is kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. This was going to happen one way or another, sadly, and there wasn't really anything anyone could do. That's kind of what you need to think about through this period of time. No one really knows what to do, and especially early on, no one's ever experienced anything this bad and this far-ranging. So all it takes, again, is one of these legs to break. Industry is in trouble because it's facing competition from other countries. Everyone's raising tariffs. We'll talk more about that. Agriculture's in trouble. Farmers made more money than they had ever made in the 5 or 6 years of the war. And then when the war ended, all of that evaporated. So we were selling food to our allies, and we were inflating the cost, and we were loaning money to our allies. So we were kind of triple dipping there. And so farmers, let's just say you're farming corn, you're going to make way more money per ton of corn than you've ever made in your entire life. And that's great for those few years. But then all of that disappears once the war's over and the other countries start to build back up. All right. So any one of these things could go under. So, what are the causes of the Great Depression? The causes are many. They're all interrelated. Economics is not an exact science. There are certainly principles of economics that are true, but you need to think of the economy as super complicated. The economy is complicated, and I always say like the human body, right? And you watch TV or listen to the radio, and you hear the commercial, the drug commercial, and they tell you to take this drug if you can't breathe for your asthma, but then the fine print says you might have blood clots or diarrhea or nausea or a heart attack. You might die if you take this stuff, but if you take it, it'll help you breathe faster. So in the moment when you're having that emergency, you'll take it, and knowing that there might be side effects, but knowing that the risk is low and it probably won't happen to you. Well, the economy is that complicated. You do anything in the economy and it can have effects all over the place that you don't anticipate. That's what side effects are. So it's this hugely complicated entity, and the things done to try to fix it are not going to be particularly effective because there's too many moving parts, right? So there's a lot of things, again, going into the Depression. Remember from our discussion about the Treaty of Versailles after World War I, Germany was forced to pay reparations, and it was billions of dollars in equivalent money. And part of the reason the Allies made the Germans pay reparations was because the Allies, Britain and France in particular, owed America billions of dollars that they had borrowed during the war. Now, of course, they had to borrow it. It was a matter of survival. But now that they have to pay for it, and remember, their economies are trashed too, not quite as bad as Germany's, but think about what they've done. They saddled Germany with a bad government and a huge debt that they can't possibly repay. And then they rely on Germany to pay that debt so that they, the Allies, Britain and France, can pay the United States. And we, of course, are demanding that they pay. And in the end, Germany is just going to throw up their hands and say, sorry, we can't pay, because their economy never recovers. And they just quit paying. The U.S., of course, will loan some more money to Germany and try to jumpstart their economy, and that won't work either. And so when they stop paying the Allies, and keep in mind, Germany is devastated. German people are in worse shape than we are. The Allies then turn to the United States and say, well, sorry, we can't pay you either. This is why you never loan money to a relative, right? Because if a relative borrows money, they're not going to assume that you're going to go break their legs or collect the money. They're going to ask for more time. They're going to ask for mercy. And you're going to give it to them because they're your relative. So that's the problem. Same thing. So Britain knows, France knows, we're not going to invade them to make them pay this money back. That's just not going to happen. And we're just going to have to eat it. And that's what we do. All right? You combine that's going on. That's one thing. By itself, maybe that doesn't collapse everything. But at the same time, in 1922, we passed the Hawley-Smoot Act, which is a raising of tariffs to one of the highest levels ever. And again, tariffs are taxes on foreign goods. So think steel. We're going to put a tariff on steel. And so British steel or French steel or German steel, whoever, is going to cost more than American steel. And the idea is that'll protect American steel in America. Well, everybody's doing it is the problem. Germany is raising tariffs, and France is raising tariffs, and England is raising tariffs. We're raising tariffs. So what happens is no one can trade with each other, and we're gonna go broke. We're gonna have problems that way. Then of course you have the stock market crash, which we've talked about already. That hurts. So you start combining all of this together, and you find that banks are losing revenue. So here's what's happening kind of with the stock market. So supply and demand, right? The more something is in demand, the more valuable it will become, okay? Or the more expensive it will become. And the opposite is true. The less something is in demand, the less expensive it will become. So imagine, and you saw the previous slide. I'll go back here a couple slides so you can look at it again. Imagine you see this rise, right, of the economy, of the stock market as it rises up. And it's been doing this for years. So people are, not people so much, but businesses are investing in the stock market. Well, banks start investing in the stock market too, which sounds really sketchy, and it is. And the reason they start investing in the stock market is because it's almost a guaranteed return, and they're not collecting money off the loans they made to Germany. Remember, the US didn't loan the money, banks loan the money, right? So banks aren't making money because those loans aren't getting paid back. They're having to invest in other things to keep the money going, so they invest in the stock market. Well, the more they invest, the more valuable or expensive those stocks come. The video you watch, Bust, I think is the one, is going to talk about how stocks were valued sometimes at 50 times their actual value. They were priced at 50 times their actual value. That's a bubble, and bubbles always burst. I mean, imagine paying $50 for a Snickers bar, right? No one wants to do that. Well, once everything kind of coalesces and you have this bubble, then the bubble pops. People start selling their stocks because they want to get out before, they lose all their money. And then you have the opposite. Stocks become devalued and the value just collapses and the bubble collapses. And now stocks that were being bought at $100 are actually only worth $2 or $1. And if you're invested in that, your money's gone, right? And so that's that initial drop that you see, the big one, where it drops right down on top of the A above Black Tuesday, which is the name for the day after this happens. And then it kind of recovers a little bit, and then you see this total downward fall for the next several years. So the stock market kicks that in. And once people started bailing out, the prices zoomed way down. All right. So the stock market crash kind of breaks that banking leg off. So again, banks are losing revenue, banks close down. This is no longer true, but until 1933, if a bank shut down and you didn't get your money, then your money's gone. And this has happened a number of times in this country. And so banks lose revenue, they shut down, and they go out of business, because banks are a business. That is a fact. And that means sort of what for us is people can't get credit. You can't buy stuff on credit because banks are shut down. Not only do you lose any savings you had, not only are any investments that you might have had, it wouldn't be a ton of that kind of stuff, but it's gone. Any money you had in the bank is gone. I read a story about a guy who had been saving for 40 years and he had amassed a pretty nice sum and he was getting close to retiring, and then the crash happened and he lost every penny, and you're not going to get it back. But you can't borrow money. That means you can't buy stuff. Businesses can't get credit. That means they can't buy stuff. They can't expand. They can't grow their business. So businesses start to close. When businesses start to close, they start laying people off, or maybe just business shuts down and they start paying people less or working people less, right? Unemployment goes way up. It soars. So the economy enters this kind of death spiral, right? And there's nothing that anyone can do about it. No one knows what to do. No one knows how to fix it. So what you end up with is a situation like this, like you see on the screen. So at the top, you see the economy slowed, unemployment rose, right? That means effectively and practically speaking, families then have less money to spend. Just think of this in the largest way possible across the board. The truth is, those who are already wealthy, they're going to be fine. They'll lose a lot of money, but they have a lot of money. But it's the middle class and the poor who are really going to be affected by this. The people that rely on their jobs to have money, that's the middle class and the poor. So if the economy slows down and unemployment goes up, and there's not unemployment insurance, there's not any of that kind of stuff, there's very little local, or there's no federal help for you if this is happening, you're just on your own, that means your family has less money to spend. And so the first thing that every family is going to do, of course, is start cutting out the luxuries, right? So today that might mean no more Starbucks trips, stuff like that, right? So all the businesses, if everyone cuts out Starbucks, then Starbucks goes out of business, right? And then you have this next wave. So Starbucks goes out of business and it lays off thousands of workers, along with all the other luxury item and service providers, they all go out of business. So that means the next round, unemployment goes up, the economy keeps slowing down. That means families again have less money. So now you're not cutting luxuries, you're cutting things that you use on a regular basis. You can live without them, but you do use them. So you get rid of one of your cars, right? You cut your TV or cable subscription back, maybe to nothing. Maybe you sell your nice car and buy a cheap car, right? Stuff like that. There are things you can do without, But again, that whole sector that was catering to those things, they go out of business too. And then unemployment comes up, and then families have less money. And pretty soon, as the spiral, goes down and down and down and down, you don't have any money. No one has any money. No one's able to spend any money because there isn't any money. And the whole economy just craters because no one's buying anything and no one's manufacturing anything, and farmers aren't able to grow anything. It's kind of a weird situation. Farmers can, of course, farm and grow crops, but they can't afford to because no one can buy it. No one can buy the food. So they actually, some of them take farm holidays. They just quit farming because it's cheaper to not even bother than it was to try to make a profit out of growing something. So we're in horrible shape. The whole system is just totally bonkers and broken. And no one knows what to do. That's the real problem. No one knows what to do. Hoover kind of becomes more and more conservative as time passes, and people just really have, they wonder, can this guy handle it? In fact, he gets blamed pretty much for everything. Most people, if they know anything at all about Hoover and about the Great Depression, they're going to associate those two things together. So he gets blamed for everything. And his name really becomes a punchline. So what you're looking at here is a picture of, I don't know what city that is, probably, I don't know, Chicago or something like that. No, this is California. This might be Los Angeles. I don't know. Doesn't matter because this is happening across the board. You can see the shacks and the shanties that are built in the foreground, and you have the city in the background. So what do you think happens when everyone runs out of money? Pretty soon you have to start making choices between feeding your family and paying rent or paying your house payment, that kind of thing. Eventually, you won't be able to do either. And so renters get kicked out of their apartments. People that are making house payments, they get repossessed and they have to move out. And they move to these communities and they build these little shacks. These little shacks individually are called Hoover Hotels. And the collection of these shacks is called a Hooverville, right? So his name becomes a joke. So think about 1932. He's saying, vote for me. We want to keep things going. And everyone's saying, why? You haven't helped us yet. It's all your fault. And his name is synonymous with the Great Depression. So it's really bad. It's, again, really, really bad. Hard for us to even imagine quite how bad things get. Unemployment, they say, has got as high as 25%. All right. A few years ago, it was 9%, and it was ridiculously high. Recently, it's been, 4%. We love it less than that, of course. Imagine where 25% of the population's out of work at a time, I should add, when not nearly as many women were working. They were relying on their parents or their husband. And of course, young people weren't working. And this then affects millions more people probably than you would think. And then remember, no unemployment benefits. You're just on your own, right? This all leads to poor diets and things like that. And as you know, especially if you were with me for 1301, when people have poor diets, they're not as healthy. They're not going to have as many children. They are more prone to sickness and disease. And so this will be a challenge during this period of time. We just got over, about 10 years earlier, the Spanish flu epidemic, which is hugely devastating to this country in 1918 and 1919. And now we're becoming susceptible to sort of normal sicknesses, but because we're not in as good of health, they make things worse. So children in particular are vulnerable, and older people are vulnerable. Children get rickets, for example. It's a disease that's a deficiency in vitamins as your bones are forming, and it can leave you with, bow legs and all kinds of sort of minor deformities, and some really bad ones. And this crops up, and it's something you tend to see in poor countries. You don't see in America, but in the 1930s, you're going to see it. Things like this. And so a lot of people are vulnerable. And again, poor diets, difficult times, all of that wrapped together. This is super depressing. I mean, physically depressing, right? Economically depressing, psychologically depressing. Everyone's depressed. Everyone's suffering. And then we could talk about hobos. Got a couple pictures of a couple of hobos here. A couple of guys out for a stroll, right? No, they're looking for work. The picture of a hobo now is sort of cutesy and kind of fairy tale and, oh, those are good old times. These are husbands and fathers who are trying to find work, and they often have to travel long distances, sometimes by foot. Sometimes they'll hop a train illegally, and hopefully they won't get killed or get caught by the police. And then they travel to some other town where they've heard there might be work. Of course, so is everyone else, right? So by the time you get there, that work's already been done, or maybe it didn't exist at all. And you're trying to make money to put food on the table for your wife and your children, and you can't. This is one of the problems with this period of time. Unemployment's 25% because there are not any jobs. It's not like today where there are jobs, just people don't want to do them, right? Places are always looking for help. They might not be great jobs, but they're jobs and they pay money. But in the 1920s, or 30s rather, there weren't jobs. No one could find a job. They just didn't exist. And so these people are reduced to this kind of existence where they're traveling around. And a lot of times hobos are associated with bums and drunks. And sure, that's what happened after years of not being able to make ends meet, after years of not being able to send money home, after years of shame. A lot of these guys turn to alcohol because it is a truism that, death, taxes, farmers are always in debt. That's the universal rule number 3. And I think universal rule number 4 is that human beings, no matter what their situation is, are going to figure out a way to make alcohol. And I think if you consider the timing, you consider the fact that alcohol is illegal right now. So a lot of the alcohol being made was homemade. Most of it was homemade, and some of it was very dangerous. This is why alcohol is regulated now. And they're depressed, and they're not in good health, and they're drinking alcohol. Man, this leads to really difficult times. So a lot of these guys never do go home if they even survive this decade. It's pretty bad, pretty tough existence. And then we could talk about depression orphans. If it hasn't sounded bad enough, wait till you hear about this one. So probably you're all familiar with the story of Annie, or Little Orphan Annie. I know they remade a movie about it a few years ago, and that's not the original story. The original story is set here in Depression America, and Annie is a depression orphan. Imagine, and I don't know how many of you have kids. It's usually a question I get out of the way at the beginning of class, because I have 6, and some of you have some, I'm sure. Imagine having to make a decision to give up one or more of your children to the state or to the local city, to an orphanage, because you cannot afford to feed them. And you know that they will die if you don't turn them over to the state. That is what a depression orphan is. There are hundreds of thousands of depression orphans. And so her story, right, is she's always, my parents are going to come back and get me. They never do. And who knows what happened to them if they died at some point later on. But they dropped her off at the orphanage because they couldn't afford to pay for her, and they felt like that was her best chance to survive. And of course, again, packing all those kids in there just breeds disease. They're not paid very much. Some are better than others, obviously, but they're not well cared for necessarily. And a lot of those depression orphans died because things were so bad. But to me, this is where things get the absolute worst, is having to make decisions like this as a parent. I don't know. I mean, I have favorite kids, but it changes every day depending on who made cookies or pies that night. In any case, this is how bad things are getting. But if you thought it was bad, it's still going to get worse. And we talk about the Dust Bowl, which happens kind of through the entirety of the 30s, but in particular in the early part of the 1930s. So here's some photographs, real photographs from that time. And you can see on the right side the dirt cloud coming over. They'll talk about some of this in the film Bust, I believe. You got the it's just dirt, and you got this guy in the middle, and the dirt's stirred up. It's not just stirred up. I mean, it's permeating the whole region. And then you got this one on the left where it looks like this car and this wagon have been buried. That's because they have. And what happens is the weather just creates this horrible situation where dirt's being lifted off these farms in one area, blown into the air. Now, some of you may have been downrange in the Middle East and seen some things like this. And then the dirt moves hundreds or thousands of miles and it gets deposited. And so it either pulls all the dirt off your farm or it buries your farm with terrible dirt because it all gets messed up along the way. People also get sick, called dust pneumonia. Again, they'll talk more about that in the film called Bust. People leave, they just bail out because there's nothing left. Everything's destroyed. Okay? Huge amounts of the crops, the little crops we did have, get destroyed. And so this is piled on top of everything else that we've been talking about. This is why all four of my grandparents, who are all four either from Arkansas or Oklahoma, this is why they left. Because it got so bad, they all decided to go west individually with their families. And of course, they all met up later on and got married. And here I am all these years later. But they all left because things were bad. And they brought their parents, some of them anyway, brought their parents with them as soon as they could because they figured at least this isn't happening out there in California. And at least maybe the weather's better and maybe there'll be something to do. And there was a lot of agriculture in California, which is why a lot of people went there. But it just devastates everything. So you roll this on top of all the other kind of stuff that's going on. And it just leads to the worst economic disaster in our history. And when 1932 rolled around and the election, Hoover gets destroyed. So in the top map, you can see the Electoral College map of 1928, how Hoover won almost everywhere, except in that, deep South section. But 4 years later, Hoover lost almost everywhere. He got destroyed by Franklin Roosevelt. We'll talk a little more about that election in the next lecture. But Roosevelt just swamped him, and you see the political cartoon, this economy is his baby now. Well, Roosevelt has a plan. And that's what we're going to talk about in the next lecture. It's called A New Deal for America. And we're going to talk about Roosevelt's plan and a little bit about how it got executed. And we'll get right up to the beginnings of World War II.